Buried beneath the veils of imperial secrecy lies the beginning of the Primarchs, a genesis bound in silence so complete that only fragments surface in the mouths of those who should never have spoken. Among them, the voice of Diocletian Custodes carries the weight of a sentinel who stood too close to forbidden truth. His recollection is not delivered as speculation or as rumour, but as testimony born from the Emperor's own shadow. The great work of creating the Primarchs was conceived in laboratories where gene forges and vaults burned with instruments beyond mortal understanding. To most of the Imperium, this was a mythic act of creation, a shaping of demigods by the Emperor's hand. Yet Diocletian hints otherwise. He describes a process strained by forces unseen, the warp pressing against the sanctity of design, whispering through every chamber where gene seed and essence were woven. He names this interference not as accident, but as intrusion, a will from beyond the veil that twisted intention into uncertainty. Each Primarch, as Diocletian recalls, bore the mark of that violation. They were meant to stand as complete beings, harmonies of flesh, spirit, and will, yet each emerged fractured. The Custodian speaks of shards, a word not chosen lightly. These were splintered reflections of the whole, facets that escaped the forge incomplete, cast into the storm when the great scattering tore the Emperor's work across the stars. It was not only distance that separated them, but essence itself, broken and spread thin. Diocletian's words fall with solemn finality. The scattering of the Primarchs was never merely a dispersal in space. It was a sundering in spirit, orchestrated by the forces of chaos who hungered for corruption, even as the Emperor sought perfection. From that moment, every Primarch carried within him both the intended brilliance of creation and the echo of warp-born intrusion. The project was wounded before it ever bore fruit. The silence that follows such knowledge is heavier than denial. The Custodian does not dwell on triumph or loss. He names the act for what it became: a flawed beginning, one that seeded every tragedy to come. In his voice, the weight of millennia lingers. And so the tale begins with a broken genesis, a truth too dangerous to be left in the open, a truth the stones of terror themselves seem unwilling to echo aloud. The Custodes were never meant to question. They were shaped to guard, to endure, to stand as silent monuments of obedience. Yet among them, Diocletian stood close enough to the Emperor's designs that silence itself became a burden. His gaze lingered where others turned away, and what he saw in the gene laboratories of the Primarch project could not be erased. He speaks of the Emperor not as distant god, but as architect. The forges of creation were his sanctum, their halls filled with instruments whose names were lost even to the mechanicum. To Diocletian's eye, the process was both meticulous and terrifying, each strand of genetic artistry bound with power that should never have answered mortal hands. The Primarchs were drawn from that crucible as ideals of conquest, intended to embody the unity of flesh and spirit that would lead humanity into its destined era. Yet even in those early stages, Diocletian recalls an unease. He describes the moment when the perfection of design faltered, when the warp itself seeped through unseen seams. He does not reduce it to failure of method or weakness of will. Instead, he marks it as inevitability, the Emperor's vision colliding with powers that refuse to yield their dominion over creation. The Custodian does not veil his judgment. He calls the Primarchs both miracle and burden, for every thread of genius in their making carried a flaw sown by the warp's touch. His words echo with the awareness that he too was a product of the Emperor's forges, though fashioned by another hand, by another design. This awareness gives his testimony weight, for he knows the difference between what was pure and what was compromised. The Emperor never spoke of this openly. His silence was iron, his gaze fixed only on the wars to come. But Diocletian, ever watchful, felt the gravity of that silence. He knew what had been birthed in secrecy, and what had been fractured before it could walk the stars. The Custodian bore witness to the contradiction that would shape the destiny of the Imperium. The Emperor had forged weapons of unity, yet their very making sowed division. In Diocletian's telling, the design was grand beyond measure, but it was never untouched. The truth lay not in the brilliance of the concept, but in the shadow that crept through its execution. That shadow would follow every legion, every campaign, every oath. It would follow them to the walls of terror. Diocletian does not soften his words when he speaks of the shards. His voice carries the finality of one who has seen what others refuse to name. The Primarchs were not scattered whole. They were splintered. Each one carried the wound of separation, in ways both visible and hidden, their essence fractured before their destinies had even begun. The Custodian describes these shards not as myth, but as fact. He names them as fragments of the Primarch's original design, aspects of will, spirit, and power torn loose during the Warpborn sundering. These splinters became entities in their own right, echoes of the greater being, yet incomplete and unstable. In them, he saw the tragic truth of what had been lost. Diocletian recalls how some shards remained tethered to their parent Primarch, surfacing as surges of rage, visions, or uncanny strength that seemed beyond even their engineered form. Others drifted further, existing as revenants that stalked the warp or haunted battlefields like reflections cut adrift from their source. He does not dress this in allegory. He speaks of it as certainty. The shards existed, and they were dangerous. To the Custodian's mind, the fracture marked the deepest flaw of the project. A single unified being might have resisted corruption. A splintered soul, by contrast, was vulnerable. Each Primarch bore within him a division, an unresolved fracture that chaos could exploit. That weakness, Diocletian warns, was not incidental. It was deliberate. The scattering had been more than dispersal across the stars. It had been a shattering of spirit imposed by Warpborn will. The word he uses, incomplete, resonates. None of the Primarchs ever stood as the Emperor first intended. Each was a vessel emptied of some part of himself, carrying only what fragments remained after the warp had taken its toll. For Diocletian, this explained the contradictions that defined them. Brilliance paired with wrath, loyalty twinned with rebellion, vision darkened by obsession. The shards were not legend. They were the root of tragedy. And though he spoke of them with solemn conviction, his words carried something darker still, a recognition that the Imperium itself had been built on the backs of fractured beings, demigods whose souls were never whole. Diocletian never hides from the word that so many feared to speak aloud: chaos. In his telling, it was no accident that the Primarchs were broken and flung across the stars. The warp reached into the Emperor's design and left its mark upon every child of that project. What emerged from the laboratories of terror was already shadowed. He recalls how the scattering itself bore the unmistakable signature of the Immaterium. The sudden eruption of psychic turbulence, the way the gene forges collapsed into silence, the untraceable dispersion of the Primarchs across worlds both savage and civilized, these were not natural failures. They were interventions. The Custodian is precise in his conviction. The warp acted with intent, and its servants sought to claim what the Emperor had dared to fashion. Every Primarch carried within him the echo of that intrusion. Some bore it in their affinity for sorcery, others in the violent contradictions of their character. To Diocletian, the fracture was never merely physical distance. It was corruption seeded at the level of the soul. He speaks of chaos not only as enemy in war, but as a contaminant that infected the act of creation itself. The Custodian describes the Emperor's silence in the aftermath, the way the master of mankind pressed forward with the Great Crusade as though nothing had been lost. Yet Diocletian knew. He had seen the fault lines written into the sons of the Imperium. He understood that the scattering was more than a test of fate. It was an assault, one that ensured none of the Primarchs would rise without shadow. His words settle with a terrible weight. The first true victory of chaos came not in open war, but in the moment of creation. The great project was bent before it ever bore fruit. The legions marched beneath banners of unity, but their gene fathers already carried division. That truth lingered in every oath, every campaign, every world brought into compliance. Diocletian, as Custodian, was shaped to recognize corruption. In the Primarchs, he saw both glory and flaw, both triumph and wound. and he knew the warp would never relinquish what it had claimed. The legions were the Emperor's chosen instruments, armies bound to the will of their gene fathers. Yet to Diocletian's gaze, each legion carried more than discipline and valor. They carried the echo of their Primarch's fracture. The Custodian speaks of this with grave clarity. The shards did not remain confined to the progenitor. They rippled outward, shaping every son of that bloodline. He recalls how the warriors of certain legions seemed consumed by fury that could not be mastered, as though drawn from a fragment of their sire's splintered essence. Others bore tendencies towards secrecy, sorcery, or obsession, reflections of traits that had been amplified by the warp's intrusion into their gene seed. Diocletian did not view these patterns as coincidence. They were the inevitable inheritance of broken creation. The Great Crusade, for all its triumphs, revealed these flaws. Some legions waged war with brilliance, only to collapse into excess or atrocity. Others brought compliance with vision, only to lose themselves in fanaticism or betrayal. To Diocletian, these were not failings born of discipline, but consequences written into their design. The sons could never rise above the fractures of the fathers, because those fractures had been woven into their souls. He remembers the weight of watching this unfold. Custodians were not permitted to intervene in the affairs of the legions, yet they observed with unyielding vigilance. Diocletian admits that he foresaw the coming of rebellion, not in detail, but in inevitability. He knew that chaos had already planted its seeds, and that the Emperor's silence ensured those seeds would one day bear ruin. In his reflection, the legions become more than armies. They become monuments to a choice made in secret, monuments built on compromised foundations. Their glories were real, their victories undeniable, yet beneath every triumph lay a fracture waiting to widen. Diocletian's words remind us that the heresy did not erupt from nowhere. It was the echo of flaws that had been present since the first moment the warp intruded upon creation. The Custodian does not judge the legions harshly. He judges the truth itself. They were what they had been made to be, wounded reflections of a dream that had been broken before it could take shape. Diocletian's words end not with judgment, but with recognition of the burden he and his kind were made to carry. The Custodes were created as guardians of the Emperor, perfected as far as human flesh could endure. Yet perfection of form did not grant freedom of will. They were silent witnesses, condemned to see what others could not, and to speak of it only in guarded fragments. In this silence, Diocletian found weight. He had seen the forges where the Primarchs were shaped. He had felt the warp's intrusion at the moment of their scattering. He had watched the sons of those fractured beings lead legions across the stars. He knew the truth. The Emperor's vision had been bent, and chaos had placed its hand upon the very heart of humanity's champions. The Custodian does not rage against this fate. He speaks of it as inevitability. To guard the Emperor was also to guard the silence of his secrets, even when those secrets carried ruin. He bore the knowledge as a weapon that could never be drawn, a truth that weighed heavier than any blade or shield. There is sorrow in his testimony, but also devotion. Diocletian does not diminish the Emperor's genius or deny his supremacy. He acknowledges the dream of unity that could have been, and he accepts the role of the Custodes as stewards of that dream, even in its broken state. The burden was to endure, not only against enemies without, but against truths within that could never be spoken aloud. His final words are measured. The Custodian knows the Imperium was built on fractured foundations, yet he remains loyal to its core. He carries the knowledge of shards, of chaos, of the great silence that cloaked their creation. And he knows that to bear this weight in silence is itself the highest form of service.